So yeah, welcome to everybody, and thank you very much, Ala, for hosting this. I felt it was particularly pertinent that it's almost exactly 100 years ago that my grandmother Edith Sollohub escaped from Soviet Russia. So the main part of her life that I'll be talking about will be from her marriage in 1906 to Count Sollohub, Count Alexander Sollohub, to when she escaped in 1921. So it's very much current to this, a century later, 100 years ago. And in fact, some of the politics and conditions of the time are resonant, I feel. I think I'm going to go to the first slide now, and hopefully everybody is here, and hope you get on there, Katya. So I just need to adjust the first screen. Hopefully I'm not sharing at the moment, because I'm fiddling behind the scenes, but I need to get to screen 1 and then share. This is my first time doing a presentation like this, so should be all right. Practiced it with Ella. Here we go. So I am hoping that you can see my slide. First slide, yes, with the title of the book, the cover of the book. Okay, if everybody can see, and if you're not familiar with Zoom, you can shrink the people on the right-hand side by pressing a little button. I'll leave that for you to discover. So this is my grandmother on the cover of the memoirs that were published in, that's a date that I don't have, but they were published this century. They were published posthumously after her death. Let me just find no, I won't bore you with finding that, but they were published sometime this century. Thanks to people that I knew who were in publishing, and thanks to my mother, who spent a lot of time in the 70s and 80s preparing the memoirs. So my mother, who married my father, Count Sollohub, prepared the memoirs for just this purpose, and thankfully eventually they have been published. So this is a picture essay based on my grandmother Edith's memoirs. It is more than, it's different to historical research. All of the information that I have probably you will find and read in the book, apart from a few personal anecdotes. But as my grandmother died in 1965, before my parents married, I never met her. And my father died in 1990 when I was 20. So my memories of him were as a child growing up, but as a teenager, also losing interest in family history, sadly, not permanently, but at that time, it was very sad to have realized too late that I didn't know enough about my father's history. So this book is a real record to have collated from her memories, written by Edith Sollohub herself in English, which was one of her favoured languages as she in her later life. So it's this essay is a personal archive of photographs and stories and memories, and also some artworks inspired by or painted by members of the family. And I'd like to add a few things at the very beginning, things that I remember of the story when I was growing up. The Papa, as I knew him, my father, Count Nicholas Sollohub, used to tell people, he was a teacher at Winchester College, and he used to tell people that he escaped in a grand piano. And I still meet people now who were taught by my father or knew my father, and they say, is it true that he escaped in a grand piano? No, it's not true that he escaped in the grand piano, but it's a great story. The other myth and that I remember is Edith hiding in the woodpile. And actually this one is true. So there's this sort of mysterious stories that cloak this memoir. In later life, Edith spent her old age a lot of the time living with one of the sons, Alec, running a chicken farm. And this also, as I grew up, this struck me as a very odd thing to do. But I think it was his working with the land, being a landowner, but it just was a bit smaller scale, being a chicken farmer. The other stories I remember, Edith hunting wolves and bears, hence this photograph. This was a very familiar photograph in our upbringing. And finally, her bearskin coat, which I remember distinctly on reading the first time, going through the memoirs when I was proofreading it, in fact, and how important it was for her to have a bearskin coat for hiding treasures, jewellery, and black bread that probably kept her alive, or certainly kept her from starving several times during her escape and imprisonment. So there's some of the things that I remember that I grew up with, these myths and truths around my grandmother's story. And then the memoirs themselves were, as I mentioned before, typed up, edited by my mother, who writes in her foreword that by the time I knew her, Countess Edith Sollohub was an old lady fluent in 4 or 5 languages, glad to have helped her sons survive and become established in Western Europe. Her youngest son, a grown man in his 50s, but still little Nick to her, was a teacher of modern languages in England, making use of the skills she had passed to him. While struggling to cook and keep house for him, she liked to tell stories about her escape from Russia, and I had the privilege of hearing some of these in her own voice, with its distinctive accent and intonation. One could still hear traces of the Scottish governess. I learned that quite soon after she reached the safety of France in the 1920s, she taught herself to type and began to record the story of her escape. She took a job as a typist in order to support herself and her sons in a one-room apartment in Paris. Only later, when her sons had grown up, did she have time to write the anecdotes about her childhood, her marriage, and above all, the influence of her father. The memoirs were written entirely in English, which, even more than French, became her preferred method of communication. No translation has been required. It was always her hope that her memories would find their way into print. When she died in 1965, she left the manuscripts to her youngest son. He, in turn, died in 1990, and as his widow, I have been very proud to prepare these memoirs for publication. This is my mother's foreword for the book, Valerie Sollohub, widow of Count Nicholas Sollohub, written in June 2009, so that gives an indication of when the book was published. So here goes. I will come to this photograph later in the talk. And I'm jumping in straight in with a piece of my own artwork. As an artist, I have been inspired very much by this story as a granddaughter who never met my grandmother, as a child of, born from this story, from this escape from the revolution, from change, from history. And if anyone's wondering, no, I don't speak Russian. I was going to say that at the beginning, because in those days, growing up in the 1980s, Cold War, Papa was a Russian spy, according to everyone I knew, which he wasn't. But that was, again, the myth around him. And we had no Russian friends locally, no Russian speaking family. So as a father of 4 daughters, alas, it was not going to be easy for him to continue speaking to us in Russian and maintaining the relationship that he had with us. So it's something that I understand now as a parent, how difficult that would have been. So instead, I have become involved in the story through reading the memoirs and through drawing. And this drawing in particular is me in the center drawing and my grandmother in the middle, sitting back to back. We never met, our feet spiral in. I'm barefoot to the top left, spiraling in, and she's booted in the snow, bottom right, spiraling in. And we meet in the middle, telling our stories in our different ways. And the things that we have in common, siblings and animals, particularly horse riding, and the people that we've met along the way. So that's my little contribution and homage to my grandmother. So I'll go back to her story. Her parents were both Russian of Baltic descent. Her father, Friedrich von Martins, which was in Russian became, and this is where I'm going to apologize for my pronunciation, but I think it is Fyodor Fyodorovich Martins. So born 1845, died in 1909. And he was a professor of international law at the University of St Petersburg and a minister of foreign affairs, hence having imperial uniform, although he wasn't in the military. Edith had an older brother who was 6 years older than her, and two sisters, younger sisters, Catherine and Mary. These are her parents, Edith's parents in 1878. And this is Edith herself on the right with her two sisters, Catherine on the left, Mary in the middle. When Edith was about 12, taken in 1898. They spoke Russian at home with their nanny. They spoke French at the table with their parents. They learned English and they learned German. She loved riding, learnt dancing. I'm not sure whether she loved it. And absolutely loved hunting and shooting. Horse riding, dogs, hunting and shooting were her real passion. And when she was about 14, I think she got her first gun. At 17, she was given a very particular gun, which I've not written down now. But at 17, she got her first shotgun. And she had a wonderful relationship with the land that they lived on and the lands that they had, including the houses, the country house of Waldensee, which I'll come to as well. So her real passion was the outdoors. This is her with her mother, also Catherine, Mary at 11, Katya at 15, standing, and Edith at 17. So this is a bit of a background to her family life. And the apartment where they lived in St Petersburg, her father's study. The salon. And another 2 rooms of the house. So in St Petersburg, they had this very fine town existence, and she was taken to dances and social events, so very much part of the time. This is the outside of the apartment in Petersburg, and I can see that it's 2 photographs joined together as they are on the notice board that I've been given, the pin board. So I'm wondering even if these might be 2 different eras joined together. That's what I suspect. And if anybody knows St Petersburg, you might recognize the address. Sadly, I was due to go in 2020 for my first ever visit to Russia. And as you might guess, that didn't happen. I was going to go with my daughter, who's 14, and explore our heritage. So this still exists, the building still exists. And on the map, this is where it is. I can't help you with directions. It's not my territory, but one day I shall go. I do have a lovely story. This is their, I've missed a letter out, it's Valdensee, B-A-L-D, Valdensee, Edith's family country house in Livonia. And I have a lovely anecdote of her passion for shooting, where she decides she wants to practice the William Tell shooting of the apple off of her younger sister Katya's head, but is told in no uncertain terms that if she ever points a gun at anybody, she'll have all her guns removed. So I think from that day on, she's a very careful guns woman. There's beautiful descriptions of her relationship with the land and the places that she loved in Valdensee, but I think I probably won't have time to read those. In 1906 then, having lived, I would say, what seems like a very free life, given all the land and the outdoor life that she had, she was engaged to Count Alexander Sollohub when she was 20 and he was 22. I am going to see if I can read a little bit actually about this, if I can find it easily, because she doesn't seem that happy. She doesn't look that happy in the photograph, and she doesn't seem particularly happy. Yes, I mean, all the tales in the book are of her with her dogs, hunting and shooting. She knows about the land, she knows the forest, she knows the horses and the peat bogs. She also talks about her time with her father, real friendship, and the importance of his work politically. In fact, at some point, while the strikes were happening, because if you think this is 1905, 1906, when there was a series of unrest in Russia, and certain parts of the country were unaffected and other parts were very much affected. So one of the things that happens is that her father, while there is a postal strike, her father organizes the people, the population, to take over the postal service so that if the strikers want to strike, they can strike. And he was very much praised by the people for this because he managed to keep the postal system going. But in the end, he was derided by the left press because he was thwarting the actions of those who wanted change. I'm just going to see if I can find a bit about. No, I can't find it. I will miss out on that bit. But she is definitely, she talks so much about her childhood and the love of hunting and shooting, and very, very little about her life with Alexander Sollohub, Sasha Sollohub. The thing she does mention that they have in common is hunting and shooting. They also skated when they were young. That's when they would have first met. And he held her hand while they skated outside, I forget the name of the building, but there was a very grand skating location where they could, there were things called the Russian mountains, where the ice was built up into waves so that people could skate up and down. And that's what she used to do with Sasha a lot. So that seemed to be the thing that they had in common. But as time went on and the marriage went on, they spent less time together, and her relationship to him seems a little bit distant, ambiguous perhaps. So I'll move on. But she did have 3 children. So this is Edith with the boys, and the little picture in the insert is when Papa, my father, is just 1 year old. He was born in 1913, Alec, the middle one, born in 1910, and Vadzima born in I can't see the dates now because I've hidden it, 1907. And she says something here about motherhood. Oh yes, here we are. So when Vadzima was born, the first child, he weighed 10 Russian pounds, which was apparently quite a good weight. But I'd never seen a newborn baby, and it was a shock to look upon the quaint, ugly little creature. The newly promoted grandparents assured me that he was a normal and fine baby, and so did the nurses and the doctor. But I feared that Sasha and I both had our doubts, which, however, we kept discreetly to ourselves. I never dared touch him and was terrified when I was obliged to watch over him for a few hours when the nyanya had to go out. It was so frightening to have to lift him or change his clothes. Anyhow, he seemed to grow satisfactorily, and although a bit pale, he was always in good health. It's almost like he's a sort of animal that she's in charge of. So she just has to look after his well-being and check that he's growing correctly. So there's a little quote from there. And then once she was married, she then becomes acquainted with the country estate of Count Sasha Sollohub. He had bought it himself in 1903, left it in the management of an uncle, I think, who mismanaged it. So by the time he, with his family, come to take charge of it in 1906, it needs quite a lot of work. So she becomes quite involved in this process, and that again seems to be a thing that they do have in common. And she's rather pleased to find it's not a castle, it's not a palace, but in fact a wooden shooting lodge. So there are no photographs of Kamenka, but this is drawn from memory by one of the sons. So Sasha himself was a military man, brought up, born in further south than Edith herself, near to Kursk, on an estate called Louisino. His family home was at Louisino, once the home of Sofia Bilorsky. And at the time, in 1905 and 6, it was much more affected by the revolts than Kamenka was. So the family were able to spend much more time at Kamenka, which was only about 50 miles away from St Petersburg. That was their sort of, they went to and fro between Kamenka and Petersburg. And in 1907, Vadzima, the first son, was born. But as I've said, she was not a natural mother, and the stories in the memoirs are more hunting and shooting. In fact, there's had to be a whole extra book published about her hunting and shooting tales, because this was her real love. In 1910, Alec was born, and here are the two of them with their little pony Mousy on the estate at Kamenka. So it was continuing to be quite a privileged and idyllic life for them at this stage, even in 1910. And at this point, they get an English nanny, Miss Taylor. And there are stories about Edith hunting and shooting her first bear at Kamenka, also wolves. And wonderful stories with the horses, the ponies and the donkey would come into the house, literally walk up the stairs and into the house at tea time for their biscuits. And that was a little anecdote I had forgotten. So I've been rereading the memoirs this week and rather like that one. Sasha himself was very involved in local government and spends a lot of time away. So she's writing about 1912 being perhaps their last normal year at Kamenka. And she references quite strongly Sasha's frequent absences and how the responsibility was already upon her to manage the house, also manage quite a lot of the estate because he would be on business elsewhere, and bringing up the children. Here are a few photographs of life on the Kamenka estate. So you can see Edith dealing with the logs. This, I think, is already during wartime. So on the bottom left, Edith managing the logging. Top left is Ivan, I think that's Ivan Ivanovich, who was their coachman. Middle photograph of Sasha with friends in 1917, that one. Sasha on the top right, hunting elves, and Edith with capercaillies in the bottom picture. And here's the famous photograph that's on the front cover. While I remember, there's another anecdote of her hunting wolves with Vadzima, and there's a point where she leaves him alone because she's seen a wolf and she thinks that the best thing to do is for her to go around and try and find the wolf around the other side of the thicket, just instructing her son to stand still if the wolf comes towards him. Stand still and enjoy, she says to him as she goes off, and only afterwards, when the wolf has passed, unshot and unwounded, that she realizes perhaps maybe wasn't the best idea to leave her son untended. So another example of that's it. While I was running around the thicket, the thought had crossed my mind that it might not have been exactly wise to leave the boy so young, all alone, to face the possibility of quite serious danger. I went back to Vladimir. He too had caught a glimpse of the bear at a distance. He was delighted at the adventure, and certainly the thought of danger had not crossed his mind. So I like that one too. Right, so this is Edith. I'm going to flick to the next slide because this has the information that is in the book. I photographed the cover of the book, Russia in Photographs. And the caption here says, in the winter of 1915, the Japanese ambassador, Baron Motano, decided he wanted to shoot a bear. All the normal companions and hosts for the ambassador being at the front. The foremost huntswoman in Russia, Countess Sollohub, was asked to act as guide and hostess. An imperial domain, Lycina, which is where their house, Louisino, was made available by the Minister of Court. Alas, the good Baron was not up to it, and the Countess had to shoot his bear for him. So this is Papa's notes here, typed, that this is our grandmother, and that it's not quite correct, that the beaters actually pushed the bear towards Mother because they did not want to have him to have the honor of killing him. Now, Papa always thinks the bear was shot in Kamenka, and would there have been an imperial shoot if it was at Louisino, and so on. So he's got a few questions there about that. But I just think it's a fantastic photograph, whoever shot the bear. And another thing I would like to say as for myself is this very mixed feeling about reading Edith's love of the countryside and even love and respect for the animals she's hunting, and very, very ambiguous, because as a child she shot squirrels and rabbits quite happily, growing up as an adult, then moving on to wolves and bears. She both loves them, respects them, is sad for them, and yet continues to shoot them, which I guess is the culture and what was expected of her. But I remember the first time I read this that I found it really difficult to comprehend the two sides of her feelings around this. You know, she describes the look in the bear's eyes as it's dying, and other poignant descriptions. And here we come to the beginning, or, you know, my story is going to take us to the time when Edith herself had to escape. So there's a few, obviously there are much fewer photographs, or none at all, because at this period she's effectively homeless and on the run. She didn't have her camera phone with her, so a lot of the following will be without images. In 1913, my father is born. This is building up to the revolution. Let's go back to, here we go. So in 1913, Papa is born, Edith's mother dies. In wartime, Edith starts managing the estate, and she seems to have quite an understanding, a sympathetic understanding of the land, the peasants, the fables, the narrative. And I think at this point it's useful to mention that the writing in the memoirs that she is talking about, where she is talking about her childhood, she wrote as an old lady from England, in England. So by this time she's had time to reflect on history, on the time passing, and so her memory is rather, yeah, sort of poignant, almost, what's the word, when you have a premonition of what's to come. She seems to talk about life in that way. So, and her connection with the land and with sympathy for the peasants, she can see the hard times that they're having, especially in the winter. So she writes of that, and she writes of some of the traditional beliefs of the peasants, including at one point the coachman, or I think the coachman says, "This horse can't stay, we have to sell this horse." And she thinks maybe it's the wrong colour, because you have to have certain colours, not to match your other horses, but for the spirit of the stable. It's quite an important thing. There's spirits in the woods, there's spirits of the stable. But apparently they'd chosen this horse to be the right colour for the spirit of the stable, so it should have been fine. But for whatever reason, the spirit of the stable does not like this horse, and this horse ends up, she has to go and visit the horse in the stable, and it is anxious, sweating, can't be calmed. So they have to sell it. And this is all based on this belief of the spirits. But I suppose also the practical fact that the horse is not happy. She maintains a great understanding of horses throughout her life, and this becomes part of her story during the revolution again as well. So by 1916, there are food shortages, the abdication of the emperor, and the searches begin. So it's no longer safe in the countryside either. There are wild men around the estate of Kamenka. It's not safe. People start shooting randomly at her family. So they start to notice a lot of unrest actually happening. But all the time, as she writes at some point, it's a bit like stuff that's happening now. You know, when you're in history, you don't know when it's going to end. You don't know what's going to happen. So all of her escape and her movements are very much, you can feel she's just living on her wits. She talks about the the 1917 revolution in October, and when the searches begin, when people are dobbing on their neighbours, for want of a better word. So this fear, and it's really, there's so much disorganization. Not even the revolutionaries, they don't know how to organize the new world. So everybody has to just live for themselves. So there's a spirit of egotism around. And anybody who is considered bourgeois or educated is under threat. So the we, as used here, not included not only the upper classes, but more or less all people with a semblance of education, who at the time were generally called bourgeois, without any real class distinction. Deprived of our customary background, we lived now as best we could, each according to his code of honour, and following his own ideas and ambitions as far as it was possible to have any. In fact, it was an altogether egotistical existence. Strangely enough, there was a certain lurid attraction in this complete disorganization, where everyone depended only upon his self, his ingenuity, his courage, and frequently also upon his sense of humour or sporting spirit. So she's alone by this time when she's writing about this. She's alone in Petersburg. Sasha and the boys are down on the estate in the south in Louisiana. And she and Alphonse, who figures quite a lot, Alphonse Reisenkamp is a family friend, and reading between the lines potentially would be her preferred best friend, over and above her husband who keeps disappearing. So she spends time in Petersburg at this time of chaos. And one of the things they do is they decide with Alphonse on a whim, they decide to go to the new government headquarters to get permits. I can't read my own writing there. I'll try and read it. That's annoying. It's the name of the, Smolny, there we go, the government. And in reading it, it seems like it's a bit of a game for them. They're best friends and they just take a gamble. And she describes how everywhere they go, they're being sent down the next corridor and sent down the next corridor. And that actually, in the end, relying on almost their good manners and their humour, they managed to persuade the new communist people in charge, the commissars, to give them a permit for travel anywhere in Russia, because they try and explain all the different places they want to go to and then say, well, actually, why don't you just give us a permit for anywhere in Russia? And the same when Edith lists all the guns and firearms that she wants to use. The commissar just writes down, okay, you've got used to use any firearm because she has so many. So they get these permits quite easily at the beginning, and it sounds like they're just having a lark. And I think they are, as you read it, you realize they're just waiting for this phase to finish. They're waiting for the revolution to end and for normal life to come back. And again, it seems very resonant of certain things and politics of our time, this, when will normal life return? So in 1917, the Red Army have by now taken over Kamenka, the country estate, so she can no longer go there, apart from to oversee some of the land and procedures that she's still allowed to take part in. But the house is taken over, furniture is burnt, books are apparently used for cigarette papers, the pages of the books, so it's already starting to disintegrate. And in 1918, realizing the continued danger that they are in, she decides to take the boys to Waldense, the summer home of her father in Livonia, And this is at this point still relatively easy. Permits are easy to get. They can go as a form of repatriation because of their Baltic origins. So she can get the paperwork, and although travel is meant to be easy, already the trains, the organization of the trains is collapsing. So it's very slow and chaotic. But eventually they get to Walensee, where she can leave her children, while she goes back to Petersburg to sort things out. And she writes that she expected to go for 2 weeks. And in fact, it becomes more than 2 years until she sees her children again. So at this time, if it's 1918, my father would be 4, and the older boys, respectively, the oldest one 11, and Alec 8, and Papa 4. So she leaves these 3 children, 3 boys, with eventually they are taken and looked after and cared for by a governess who at that point Edith has never even met. So that's part of the later story. So everything was just, managing from one moment to the next. On the 11th of November 1918, the armistice, the Germans withdraw. They were currently in the Baltic states, so they withdraw, which means that the frontiers closed. So this is why her idea of just popping back to Petersburg and coming out again no longer works, because the borders are closed. So I'm about halfway through my paper. I'm wondering where I am at in the talk. A little bit over, so I will see how we go. Now, once she's back in Petersburg, Petrograd by now, as it is called, and she is alone once again. She doesn't know what has happened to her husband, Sasha. He presumably has gone to fight, and she starts looking for ways to escape, for example, via Finland. She has former servants. I think she must have had quite a good relationship with many of them, not just the horsemen, which she definitely had a good relationship with, but there's a servant, Marcia, who seems to be quite well connected in the new world with her slightly dodgy boyfriend, a chauffeur. There's Ivan, the coachman of the Petersburg flat, who becomes the house commandant, I think he is. And so he's very happy to help her, even as a new communist, and he helps her hide the guns that are hidden around her flat. She realizes that she cannot afford to let these be discovered. So they bury the guns under the stables of the coach house. And for all we know, they're still there, because they were buried in the ground rather than hidden in the fabric of the building. There's a woman called Elsa, who's a bag woman, and these were people who would go back and forth trafficking goods. And she could still be supplied with stuff from the land at Kamenka. People would bring her food. And at one point, somebody brings her a list of what remains, like an inventory. This is what's left in Kamenka, which sadly is somewhere where she never ever goes back. So she starts foraging, and again, Alphonse appears in her life. He's in hiding. His life is much more threatened. He's more wanted, but he stays in Petersburg, Petrograd, because his father, a general, is dying and unable to move. So the two of them are looking for ways out. In December 1919, she is invited to Moscow as a relative of the Kaczynskis, who are a Polish family. She's not a relative, but they find a way to give her the name of Maria Adamczewski. My writing is terrible, and my pronunciation perhaps even worse. But she becomes a young Polish woman, a relative of the Kaczynskis, and she obtains a travel permit. Let's see. Hmm. This is the point where she learns that the estate, Kamenka, is, I think this is the Kamenka one. I may have got my estates muddled. One or other of the estates is being taken by the Soviets now. And this is a summoning her to a district rural committee, where she has to argue her case about what she may or may not do on the estate, what she may or may not keep. So there's quite a few papers from this time, which are the original papers, you can see, which she had somehow managed to keep during her escape. So at this point in January 1920, this is where she has the permit for travel from Petrograd to Moscow for Maria Adamchevska. And there's some complicated story whereby she gets to Moscow. She then wants to come back to Petersburg and then is unable to travel back to Moscow. So she makes up a story about her father dying. And then she needs to get a doctor who's willing to invent or use a fake, somebody's real death to become her dead father. So because for everything, it seems like for everything you do, you have to have papers to do it. So if you say you've got to travel because your father's dead, you need a death certificate to prove that your father is dead. And I'm not sure whether that's one that I've got, but that's one of many papers that she has to obtain. So as the Polish cousin Maria, she eventually stays with the Krasinskis in Moscow, where a moment of serendipity occurs where the son Andrei teaches her Latin in exchange for her teaching him English. And this proves very useful later on. Already at this time, she spent a year and 4 months separated from her family, because all of this time she was spent, there's anecdotes about her moving around Moscow, visiting people, staying with her Aunt Lely, trying to go from one house to another without risking anybody else's life. There's also stories about her making one of her, perhaps something that keeps her alive, perhaps, is her relationship with the horses that are by now starving along with the people in both Moscow and St Petersburg, where she helps the horses that are collapsing in the street, and through her horsemanship she is able to get a horse up. If you know about horses, once they're down, usually that's it, they're down. And if they can stay up, if you've read Black Beauty, if they can stay up, they get another lease of life. They get fed. If they can do the work, they get fed, they can keep going. But once they're down, they're down. So one of the things that she does and she writes about in her memoirs is helping these poor beasts to survive. So there's a lot of time, a lot of fear, a lot of checks, searches, suspicions, betrayal, neighbours betraying neighbours, the checker out to get people. And by the time she's with the Krasinskis in Moscow, the whole point was that she was going to be a Polish refugee that was going to be repatriated. This was the story. And she had this permit to join the Krasinskis and escape to Poland, but their permit falls through. So the whole family stays in Moscow. And eventually, as is inevitably going to happen, in March 1920, she's arrested and is taken to the Lubyanka prison. And there's stories even here of how her kind of wits and survival, her friendships with people, her connections with people, her willingness to talk to people, and perhaps her apparent frailty, because I think if you think she's still only early 20s, although albeit a mother of 3, maybe she's late 20s by now, mother of 3, she must be 20, no, maybe she's even, anyway, she's still young and appears young, in fact is mistaken for a young boy at times, which also helps her survive. And so she's looked after quite a lot in the prison by older women, and there's bizarre stories like 2 French ladies who she befriends in the prison, who she meets 5 years later in Paris, and they have a conversation about remembering each other from prison, much to the surprise of passers-by, not realizing that they're talking about Soviet prison. So she's constantly trying to plan for escape from the prison. She recognizes in the next cell that the son that she's exchanged Latin and English lessons with is in a next door cell, and she digs a little hole through the wall. He passes a knife through. She's got the bread but no knife. He's got a knife but no bread. So between them, they pass a knife through the wall, and she can cut slices of bread and fit them through the little crack in the wall. Sadly, he is never seen again after his time in Lubyanka prison. She's even taken at one point to Buryski prison, which was considered to be a much longer term prison. But again, through her conversations with the guards, with the commandants, with the people in charge, she seems to each time win people over. This seems very significant. She wins people over, and eventually she's released from Lubyanka prison because she studied Latin. So this young boy who'd been helping her learn Latin actually potentially saved her life, because it is assumed, and she quickly jumps on the story, that she's learning Latin to study medicine. But she has to sign something which says that she will not ever leave Moscow. So as Maria, the Polish girl, she is not allowed to leave Moscow ever. So she has to keep plotting. At this point, she needs a new ID. She takes on this name, Evdokia Fyodorovna Sollohubova, in 1920. There is a reason why the name is so similar to hers, and that's because the person writing it forgot to write a false name. So they had to quickly change Sollohub to Sollohubova. So that could have been very risky were she to be recognized. By now, friends and family, they're all trying to work. The only legal way to exist is to work. You cannot exist without work. You cannot have a permit for food and a right to do anything without work. So everybody becomes a worker. And in fact, some of her friends and family did this rather cheerfully and took to the new systems very well. But very often those same people also met their sticky end. So I think her persistence in getting to escape meant that she didn't end up. So she had many plans for escaping. I'm hoping you can hear me because it says my internet is unstable. She at one point is given a permit to travel with a timber company, which would have allowed her to get to the Polish border and just cross over quite easily. And because she's still friends with Alphonse, he is by now in dire trouble, she actually gives him her last permit to travel. She's got a permit to travel, and she gives it to Alphonse, which meant she has to wait still further. So I still think this is some sort of love story, and certainly a story of loyalty and friendship, that she allows him to leave. So her final possibility is she joins the orchestra. She joins an orchestra that's traveling west to a place called Mogilev. And as a violinist. So again, her background, her training allows her to play in this orchestra. And here's a travel permit for her to travel on the 8th of June to Mogilev, and a membership card for her to be part of this orchestra. Now she's thinking all the time how awkward it would be, because she's going to stay and play in the orchestra for 4 weeks apparently, and she thinks, how can she become known as a violinist and then escape further? Once she's known as a violinist and part of this theatre, then it'll be harder for her to escape. So she deliberately cuts quite deeply one of her fingers and says to the director that she can't play. So this allows her to still be kept as part of the orchestra, but not to be visible on the stage. So this is another of her foresights to do this. But as the Polish and Russian army are constantly sort of moving back and forth, at one point the theatre and everybody starts retreating at a point where she's still trying to get to the front. So she knows that she now needs to do something different. If she can't stay with the theatre because they're being sent back, she needs to move forward. So she joins the Red Army as a nurse. So this is less visual, so I hope my facts are leading the story now. So she gets a doctor's letter, and this is a doctor, again, all of her connections are so vital here. At some point she's visited a Catholic priest that she recognizes from Petersburg, and he gives her the name of a commissar, and she manages also at this time to get a doctor's letter to join the Red Army. So these are all connections, people that she meets. On the military train, she meets, this is as part of the Red Army, she makes almost a friend, somebody that, were he not a communist, she would call a friend, somebody called Grigoriev, who starts off being rather suspicious of her, and also very suspicious of her class, of her education. You know, asks her, how come you know this, and how come you can do this? Where did you learn that? So she invents a whole story that she has to keep around of her French mother, hence being able to speak French, and why she plays music, and how come she's trained to be a nurse, and why does she want to go to the front when it's going to be so dangerous. So she invents stories and stories and stories. Another moment of charm, I think, is where she goes to find boots from a cobbler at one of the train stops, and he suggests that why doesn't she just stay with him and marry him, because he's a good cook, and if she could come back in a few hours, he would show her the stew that he's cooking and invite him to stay as his wife, which she doesn't do, but it's a nice thought that at any point her path might have changed. There's another story of her background, her upbringing, affecting her behaviour, where everybody gets off the train at some point and goes to steal potatoes from the land, and she decides that she can't steal from the landowners, so she goes hungry for about 3 days while everybody feasts on baked potatoes, until eventually she gives in and goes to steal the potatoes, but says they're the worst tasting potatoes she'd ever had. I think probably because she felt so guilty about it. Okie dokie. Carrying on, she joins the 17th Division. This is having had help from the Commissar to get to the front, and this is directly from the help from the Catholic priest. Another proposal of marriage from one of the sentries, and another friendship with Dr. Zurov, who is part of the army. They talk about shooting, they become friends, and eventually she tells him the truth of her story. At this point, she has arrived at the front. She is in a town called Volkovisk, and I think this is by now in Poland. So having told Dr. Zurov and the landlady where she's staying, there are plans to to help her at this point. And the landlady and her family, they write down Edith's details so that they can hide them not in just in one house, but in two houses, so that were anything to happen, they would know who she was and be able to send information to her family in Estonia, wherever they might be, because she, by this time, I think she's heard from them that they are in Estonia, but she still doesn't know how they are and how to get there. The final escape then is in this town of Volkovisk in late September of 1920, when the Bolshevik army start packing up to leave. Now she's a member of the army, so she has to play the game and continue playing the game, packing, helping label the boxes. She labels all the boxes, saying exactly what they are, what's inside them. And the soldiers around her start asking her to label even more boxes, which she willingly does, because to her mind, she's thinking, well, at some point, if this army train ever gets stopped, the Allies will know exactly what's in the boxes, so it'll actually be helpful. And she waits till the very last minute. I mean, again, it's so much living on her wits. She knows that if she acts suspiciously, she could get caught at any time. So she plays the part, packs the boxes, helps everybody get ready. The train is going to leave at exactly 11:30. She must be there. Has she got her stuff? And she says, no, I'm just going to go back to my lodgings and go and get my stuff. And that's where she escapes. So she stays in her lodgings, but in order to stay safe, her landlady finds a space in a woodshed, in a wood pile, which is where my memory came from. And she's able to stay kind of deep within all these logs of wood with a little bit of water and food for possibly just a number of days, while the Polish army and the Russian army fight back and forth over this frontier. And there's even a point where she comes out for a bit and it seems to be safe, and she sees a Polish soldier shooting just by himself. He's shooting and trying to keep the Russians that are just there in the woods back from the front. And she ends up being recruited by the Polish soldier to get water for the machine gun to keep it cool. So she's part of this process. And then just in case the Russians come back again, she has to dive back into the woodshed, into the woodpile. Now, in my memory, I can picture and imagine that at some point there's a Russian soldier sticking sticks through the woodpile and she's narrowly dodging them. But I might have got that from another film. I don't know. But that's my story about that. So yes, here is a map that shows a little bit of the story. So it's a photocopy. It's a photograph of a photocopy. So the points, and I don't have a cursor, I can't lead you around this story, but you can see from Moscow to St Petersburg and the train journey going north east up to St Petersburg, and from there to the left, to the west of that, you'll reach Estonia, and a number of names that are in the book about where they travelled after their escape. But in order for her particular escape, she had to go to Moscow, and from Moscow down you can see Kursk at the bottom, and that's near where their Sasha's country estate, where he was born, was Louisino. That's down there. Circled underneath St Petersburg, there's a town called Tosna. That was where Kamenka was, their country estate. And then if you follow the line going almost directly west from Moscow, that was the train line that she was on for her final escape. So by the time she is free, and to some extent her experience of freedom is not very free, because by now borders are closed, travel is very difficult. She goes first to Paris to recover, at this point, she learns news of the boys. Now they are being looked after by this couple here. And I think they lose touch with them eventually. I don't know what happened to this couple, but they took on these 3 children, my father, his 2 older brothers, and looked after them for no money, for nothing, just because. So while Edith is recovering in Paris, this is her first place to rest. She learns news of the boys who are safe with this couple, but she also learns that Sasha indeed died in 2018, was shot in fighting. So her sense of being alone was justified. I don't know whether it helped her to know that he wasn't around, and she hadn't just been abandoned. And here she is, reunited with her sons, not until 1921, finding the boys in Estonia. And I think this is possibly a little bit later than that. But there's another anecdote of my father, who at this time, so he was 4 when he last saw her, and maybe 6 or 7. It was over 2 years, 2.5 years until she saw them again. And he doesn't quite recognize her. And he says, "But I always thought you'd arrive on a horse." So that's really sums up her relationship with horses, the importance of her life on horseback. So the rest of the slideshow I can whiz through because this is less history and more family. So there are pictures of the boys here in, I think by now, Waldense. So they were able to safely go back to the country house in Waldense because this was not Soviet Russia. And if you see the little insert where the boys, presumably pre-revolution, happier faces than sitting around the table at Waldense, looking rather sad. And I would say that is Katya on the left. So Edith in the middle. Papa, I think, in the middle, and Alec, my guess, on the right. 2 of the boys, Papa and Alec, I would guess, the 3 sisters, and I think Katya and Mary on the right. Mary, so Katya was the middle sister, and she was an artist. Mary was the younger sister of Edith, and she always struggled. She had whatever difficulties, but animals were her love too, but pets. So her life was, irrevocably altered by the revolution, and she found solace in animals. And these are rather happier photographs as they grew up. Very handsome young men with their mother, but she does maintain that haunted look. And then with them as older, rather rounder chaps. I don't have a date for that photograph, but given that she died in 1965, so I'd say it's around 1960. And Papa in the middle with the white flower, Alec on the left, Badzim on the right. Lots of stories I've mentioned already about her relationship with animals, dogs, hunting dogs. I know that these dogs have names and Papa would be able to tell me, but I have forgotten them. Now, one of the sons, Alec, married Countess Claudignoli and ended up living in both Italy and chicken farming in Kent. And this is Edith in Ostia, 1955, and I'm guessing looks like an English countryside, the top photograph. And Katya, who became known to us as Aunt Bully, also lived in Italy. So there were connections with Italy throughout, and I still have cousins living in Italy. This is Edith in England, age 60 in 1946. That's if I've got my maths right, because I've put the titles in here. And she died age 79 in 1965 in Winchester, living with my father at this stage. She'd lived with Alec for some time of her life, and then ended up living with little Nick, my father, Papa, in Winchester, where he taught at Winchester College. And this is where she ended her life. And she was a Catholic. She was buried in the Catholic cemetery in Winchester. So here are the family photographs. This is Fadzima, Papa Nick, and Alec, with Maria, Katie, which is me in the middle, and Sasha. These were the first three born of Papa. So you can see he was a much older father, which is why sometimes people mistake his name for being my grandfather, but he is indeed my father. Fadzima never had any children, and Alec on the right had children who were a generation older than me. So, for example, Michael, Alec's son Michael, his children are my age. So there's a generation gap there. So Alec had 4 children, 1 who died, 3 who remained alive, 2 in Italy, 1 in England. And so I have a set of cousins who were also Sollohubs in England. This is Aunt Mary, who ended up living in Fürstenfeldbruck near Munich, living with cats, dogs, guinea pigs, all sorts of animals. That was her solace. And this is us 3 girls with Aunt Mary. And I put this in, I wasn't going to put it in because that's me screaming, but I was looking at it because I was baptized Russian Orthodox, and I thought, here's the evidence of that. But also when I looked at it closely, so I was baptized in 1970, that is Aunt Bully standing on the back of the queue. And that's all the photograph I've got of her in this particular talk. So I've put that in for fun. And these are Aunt Bully's paintings, which we have lived with all our life. She painted prolifically. I think she sold them for £1 to tourists in Liguria, a place called Borgia Verezzi. And I imagine the scenery is much changed. But she lived famously sort of barefoot, sleeping in shepherds' huts, being very much looked after by the local community, as was Mary in Germany. So they were classic refugees, I think, living however they could. And this is the Winchester branch of the Sollohub family. The 3 of us were in the earlier photograph with the 3 brothers, and then along came Natalia. And so this is some little family shots with a couple of dates from 1980, the one at the bottom. And you can see my mother in that photograph as well, bottom middle. My mother, Valerie, who married my father in 1996, I think, just after Edith died. Apparently she died the day after Papa told her that he was getting engaged, almost as if she was handing over the responsibility to my mother. And the last photograph here, 1987. So just showing Papa growing up with his 4 daughters. So you can imagine that was probably quite a task. And this is how I remember Papa, not so much as the handsome young man on the left, but I think I was very proud of photographs like this, because I think he's very handsome. And in the middle here is a very familiar photograph. That was his look. He was a very kind, funny man, and I think, like his mother, grew up valuing his friendships and connections with people and charming people. He also loved the garden, as did she. And there he is in the garden with Timmy the tortoise, I can just see, crawling about on the grass. Some facts, should you want them. I'm not going to read these out because they are in Papa's handwriting and they are names I don't know. But this is, Papa loved to keep a check on everybody. And this is the relations through the Tour family, which is Edith's family. And I have recently been bequeathed a portrait of Catherine von Schneider, and I'm guessing it through looking at this family tree that she is Edith's grandmother, and I'm guessing therefore the painting is around 1860, but those are my guesswork. So I'm willing to be corrected by family or other on that. And this is on the other side of the family, the Sollohub side, the Sollohub side. Papa had managed to find the direct line all the way back to 1413 of the family Dovonia, Sollohub, and somewhere along the line that these two names were joined and then no longer used. But again, I'm not an expert on all of these, but he does come all the way down from 1413 all the way down through to Nicholas marrying Valerie Drew, and then I've added in my own biro the children and of each of me and my sisters down to Louisa, my daughter, and you can see there's the Italian branch there as well. On my father's side, there is also this connection to the Wilorska, Sophie Wilorska, on the right-hand side. There's a little detail there. And this is where I'm going to end, with a painting by me, self-portrait as a Russian doll. And it sums up, again, I think, that story within a story within a story, the mythological, the spiritual, the imagination, the wondering who you are-ness of this story. And at this point, I was taking photographs of myself, and I think this is me looking at myself with a photograph or a painting of myself in the background. So I had various versions of myself in the image as I painted it. And in the very background, almost like a halo, is the charcoal drawing, an image of the charcoal drawing in the background of that. And in the middle, between my hands, is my little daughter, Louisa, as a thought. I think I painted this perhaps when I was pregnant. I'm not sure. Or just after I'd had her. If the date's correct, it's after I had her. So I'm now going to see if I can stop sharing this, unless I need to leave it on this screen. And I'd love to hear from you. I've got no idea of the time. I've just kept talking. So I hope I haven't overdone it. I've gone way over.
All right, thanks very much, Katie. That was a fascinating story. And
oh, thank you. I haven't looked at any chat, and I'm really sorry about going so far into the time, because we don't leave much time. But I'm now going to look at the questions or the chat. So thank you, Ella. If there are any questions. Okay, so somebody says, Katya, thank you. The Martins house then became Dom Moda in Soviet times. It is a very famous house. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
There was just one question I was going to say. You didn't quite mention about what your father did, because you mentioned the fact that you lived in Winchester, but
yeah, he taught at Winchester College. So they went to Paris as refugees. That was the place after Estonia, after the reunion. They went to Paris as refugees, and she had to teach them French because they hadn't had that background. So she had to teach them French so that they could go to school in Paris. And then from there, my father ended up going to Cambridge to do, I think by then, a master's in economics, bizarrely. So he ended up in Cambridge, and from Cambridge ended up teaching at Dartmouth Naval College, teaching Russian. And from Dartmouth, he moved to Winchester and taught modern languages in Winchester. at Winchester College, and that was how my mother met him, because she was a trainee teacher in the teaching college, and she went to visit the language lab where my father worked, and I think he just charmed her with his foreign good looks. And one thing I'd like to say is I never knew, I was talking to my sister yesterday, and I never really heard his accent, because to me he was just Papa, but apparently he had a strong accent, possibly more French at that point than Russian, I don't know. Somebody's asked how many members of my family speak Russian. I've been learning it on Duolingo, so I can't say that I speak Russian. My sister Sasha does speak Russian, and her daughter Francesca speaks Russian. So that is two of the family currently speaking Russian. The Italian branch, my cousin Mishu, she did speak Russian, and she married a Russian and spent some time going back and forth. She actually visited some of the land, the estate of Kamenka. So there is Russian spoken, but not sort of as a family language. I think the disparation of the family just meant that the connections weren't there. And how come my grandmother was given the name Edith? I don't know. Is it an unusual name then? She was Edith Natalia.
Edith is not a typical Russian name. I was wondering whether there's any Livonian connection, because I noticed in one of the documents it was Edita, making obviously as Russians can't have a female name ending in a consonant, it's difficult, so they add an A. They do that with a lot of names.
Yes.
Edita.
Well, I think she did have Baltic, Livonian background roots. So although her parents were Russian, that was part of the connection with Livonia. So I think yes, her name probably reflected that. And Katya, you remember my father? Oh, that's good to know. My younger sister had some connection. She made a connection with your name, so it's lovely to hear from you. We weren't quite sure what the connection was, so. But my younger sister, who is also Edith Natalia,
I think these emigre Russian.
Sorry, the connection is difficult, so I can't hear what you're saying. I'm afraid, Katya, sorry. If you type it, I can read it. Michael, you've asked what became of Alphonse. Oh, now let me see, because my other sister, Sasha, so I have three sisters, Maria, Sasha and Natalia, and Sasha was born on the 1st of May, which was actually my grandfather Sasha's birthday as well. And she has told me something about Alphonse, that he did escape and he did survive, but they never met again. He survived and died in Poland. Edith never saw him again, and it was presumed he'd been killed, but he actually did survive. So that's rather sad, because I think, whether it's true or not, but I feel like it was a love story.
Your father was a very distinguished teacher. Your father was a very distinguished teacher of Russian, and taught a lot of really quite distinguished Russianists. I taught Russian at Leeds, and we had people coming from Winchester. And one of my good friends, Richard Davis, I don't know whether Richard was actually at Winchester or not, but the name Countess Sollohub in Russian circles of my generation was very well known.
Yes. I sometimes I come across people out of the blue who recognise my name, and anybody who knew Papa would have remembered him, no doubt, and remembered him fondly.
It's probably worth mentioning Robert Chandler at this stage, because he wrote for the book, and he did some of the translations school as well, and he was a student of your father's, and
He was.
created Italian. He
Yes.
was very quick.
He was a student of mine as well in Leeds. So there we are. There's a very, very
And
gifted student. Yeah.
I remember Robert Chandler because he used to come to our house often. So yes. Yeah. Oh, and my sister Maria is here. So maybe you can see the family relationship, this family resemblance as we wave at each other across the ether. Maria lives in Norway. So she's keeping up the Nordic tradition. I tend towards Italy. That's my calling. So I can speak Italian, which is
Katie?
nice.
Katie?
Yes.
One of the photos. Have you seen who he is?
Oh,
That's
yes, I know.
The picture where the boys are sitting together and Philip looks just like Papa.
Yes, yeah. So this is Philip, Maria's youngest son. So there's family resemblances coming through here and there. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and Martin, you were taught by Papa in the 70s. And thank you.
That's right. Yeah.
That.
Yeah. Very happy memories. Yes. And he had a very direct method of teaching Russian. A lot of emphasis on just listening to what he was saying and trying to make sense of it, but only understanding his call for action, but somehow getting by nevertheless. So,
yes.
Yeah, it was a great privilege to have been taught by someone who really was a real Russian at that time. There weren't so many of them about in this country.
Yes, that's the thing, isn't it? And as Katia said, the emigre Russians stuck together, but when you were stuck down in Winchester, there weren't so many to stick to. We did, when we went to London, we would feel more of the community and go to the Russian church, but in Winchester there were few and far between. So thank you. And I think learning from Nick at school would have been a great experience. Learning from Papa at home was really difficult.
Yes.
And I think I admitted to my mum that he'd made me cry, and she admitted to me that he made her cry. And you wouldn't believe it, for this gentle soul, that when it came to teaching languages or teaching Russian in particular, he just couldn't understand why I had no knowledge whatsoever of anything. And I thought, but I'm only 10. I don't know what you're talking about. And it was just far too complicated. So sadly, I gave up. But as I say, I now do the Italian branch. I visit the Italian branch of the family of the Sollohubs, and I can communicate with them in Italian, which is lovely.
You redeemed yourself by learning another language. Yeah,
at least one language. But as I said, Sasha and her side are now following the Russian route, and who knows, my daughter might also do that. Yeah, I agree.
Katie, you may have said, I may have not picked it up. How did your father find his way to England?
That was through university. So from Paris, he went to Cambridge University. So he got a scholarship. I think because they remained poor, and he would have only have managed it through scholarships. So he went to Cambridge on a scholarship.
So it was through education here. Yeah. And then he suddenly becomes part of the system, and he maintains his Russianness, but he belongs in England.
Yes, he belongs.
You've been brought up like that, in kind of basic English with a kind of Russian floating through as part of your childhood.
Yes, but I think he was always really quite scared of the Russianness, because it was not scared of being Russian, but of going back. For example, he never went back. He was very scared of being caught out somehow. At one point, he and I were going to go to the Russian Olympics, the Moscow Olympics, and he decided he couldn't go back. So we never went then. And there were countless other stories of his the effect it had on him. Maria was reminding me that we weren't to tell him how much our clothes cost, because that would frighten him, this extravagance on spending money on clothes. He didn't like the fact that after my namesake Katya, I would walk barefoot around the streets of Winchester and paint pictures. And he really found that distressing because he'd had to go without shoes. But he did teach me how to run through stubble. He said, you have to push your feet forward so that you don't land on the spiky stubble field, because he'd learnt this with his brothers chasing him around the fields. He'd learnt how to run through stubble barefoot. So that's something I can thank my father for. I can now run through stubble barefoot. Yes.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yes, please do.
Did your grandmother ever mention, did she ever mention anywhere why the Soviets, the young Soviet Republic, why they wanted to keep people in? Why was it difficult for people to travel and to go abroad? Because my family in Russia, they stayed. They had no choice. They stayed.
Yeah, yeah.
I was just wondering, why was it so hard? Why they wanted everyone kind of sealed inside the country? Did she mention anything?
There is in the writing. I think at the beginning, they were actually actively encouraging people to leave if they were from somewhere else. So I guess maybe the trying to keep people in was if they were Russian, they needed to be Russian and stay there. But anybody who wasn't Russian at the beginning was encouraged to leave because it was fewer mouths to feed, because the whole country was starving. You know, it was First World War and then revolution. So I think probably by the time the borders closed because of the end of the war, the First World War, I think that was the thing, that by then it wasn't maybe even that the Russians wouldn't let anyone leave, but that the borders were so controlled. It was hard to leave, and maybe by that time anybody who left would have been a traitor somehow. This is me thinking it aloud. But I know that at the beginning it was okay to leave, which is how she got the boys out, because everybody could leave. And I think it was just a question of the chaos and suspicion that arose, that perhaps once the borders were closed and the Soviet Republic was trying to grow, it wasn't safe for anybody to leave.
And as a comment, probably, if you control the borders, you need to control the population inside it as well.
Yeah.
So the freedom of movement is, if you want to seal the country in,
yeah,
the freedom of movement is not encouraged as well.
Yeah, yeah. So I think they just missed the window when it would have been allowed. You know, just everybody who wants to leave, and then that's it. Yeah, yeah.
I'm interested, Katie, can you hear me now, or am I still on mute?
Yes, yes.
Those little pieces of paper and those what are called propusks, so they're passes to go through.
Yeah.
That your grandmother has kept. My grandparents also kept masses of them. And it's fascinating, these, because they obviously had a date to them. They only lasted for 15 days, some of them, or 3 months. And yet they carried them through immigration, through their lives in England, and then life right through. I mean, I've got a whole trunk of them, and it obviously meant something very important. So do you have any theory about what those little pieces of paper meant to your grandmother?
She doesn't talk about that, but as somebody who has inherited a real need to hold on to everything, just in case. Yeah, you have that too. Yeah. So we all have this. Maria too. I think that would be it, because if you are so dependent on it, maybe you might need it again. Maybe you might need the proof that you once, you know, if everything was changing so rapidly, even though they were short-lived passes, at least you could prove that you had a pass, and maybe you would get the next pass based on the passes that you had before, like a paper trail. And I wonder whether also it's the only thing you've got, so you're kind of gathering.
Yeah, they had no passport, did they, after 1922?
But also maybe even sentimentality. You know, if you lose all your possessions and then you are given a piece of paper, whatever the piece of paper is, maybe even if it was a sweet wrapper, meaningless, it might become important because it's yours. So maybe it's even as simple as that. It's just a thing that belongs to them that they want to keep. Yeah.
That's a good painting.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I have one of my ambitions in you know, I've written in my sketchbook is I want to paint everything. And I think it's that, you know, I just want to paint everything that exists. There's this sort of real need to anchor myself. And I think we inherit trauma and something around that story.
That was a lovely plate. It looks like a plate. I mean, you said it's a charcoal drawing, but absolutely beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Reminding me in design of some of the kind of Soviet plates of the 1920s, and it's very stark, angular, put together with the whole story. It's like kind of reading an icon. The same kind of thing. I noticed there was a bare foot at one point somewhere up in the left-hand side.
Yeah, that was my bare foot. Yes, because I always liked to walk barefoot when I was young, and I imagine her in her booted foot in the snow.
The way you've painted the foot reminds me very much of an icon I have painted by a Russian icon painter there is a foot in that also with the toes kind of widely spaced. And people who don't wear shoes a lot find that their toes get widely spaced. It helps them to. We have a lady who helps us clean here, and she comes from, where does she come from, Dorothy? From the Solomon Islands, and she's probably didn't wear shoes, and her feet are very, very wide like that, which is unlike our feet, they're all pinched together.
Yeah. Well, I've maintained my barefoot tendency, so I like a wide-fitting shoe and very spread apart toes.
You're able to go barefoot as well because you're reasonably well off. Poor people don't go barefoot because it's a shame.
That's true. Yes, so it was my choice. Yes. Yeah. Barefoot through choice, definitely. Yeah.
Katie, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
It really is a fascinating story, and it's interesting that you talked about Edith, your grandmother, and the story of your grandfather, where the name actually comes from, isn't it? Sollohub or Sollohub, as we know it in Russian. That tree that you've shown, that going back to 1400s, that's quite amazing. And it does take us back, and I know that you now feel that heritage.
It's been really, really useful to do this talk because I've read the book before. I've been given the paperwork to, it's my archive, but to tell it in my words and to reread it has been really amazing. And recognizing certain things about my grandmother, her reluctance in her marriage, I think it resonates with me. Her love of the outdoors, and she'd rather be riding a horse than looking after her babies. I've done both. I ride horses and I've brought up a baby, but I only had one, so it made it easier. But yeah, there are some lovely connections with her kind of attitude. I think when you read it, it's her kind of annoyance with certain ways of being, and she gets given a naval costume when she's 10, I think, for Christmas, and she's really offended that people assume it's for her brother when it's for her. She's a very down-to-earth woman living, just living her life, very independent thinking. And I think we've all inherited that, which is also lovely. And doing this and looking at all the connections is also reminding me of how important and the connections for her were, this reliance on the kindness of strangers and relatives, and how we can all, use that, and how my father also quite obsessively kept all his contacts, kept an eye on, kept in touch with people. Again, this kind of keep close, know who you know, really keep everybody, keep connected, I think.
The Russians have a very nice phrase which translated is probably better 100 friends than 100 rubles. Не имей 100 рублей, имей 100 друзей.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you.
It fits in very well with your story, absolutely.
That's lovely. Thank you. Yes, yeah. And I recommend that you read the book. I read it backwards, bizarrely, this time round. I started at the end because I felt that was the bit I had to talk most about, but there were fewer pictures. So I read it chapter by chapter from the back to the front, which, if you feel like it, you could do it that way. Or if you've read it before, go backwards. It's quite interesting. Yeah, I'm going to read loads of books like that now. Just go backwards.
How did the book get published? In 2009?
Yeah,
Yes.
That was actually thanks to me, I can say, because I knew the brother of the publisher. So one of my good friends in Brighton was married to somebody whose brother was a publisher, and I went to a book launch about a man who was a refugee from Chile, from the Chilean Revolution, and I was chatting to them at the time, and I said, oh, my grandmother was also a refugee, and more connections. So it was through friends. Yeah.
Well, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for staying, if you have stayed, because I know it's been very long.
It's fascinating.
Thank you very much.
So I didn't notice the time, but it's great. Oh, hi, Joe.
Can we get in touch, Alla? Can we keep in touch with you?
Yeah. I'd
Yes,
love
cool.
to. Anybody. I'm very happy for anybody to get in touch via Alla, or just look me up, because it's you'll find me.